I wanted a place for people to receive authentic guidance and practical ways to awaken. Thought-provoking, paradigm-shifting, and empowering. This is about expanding our human consciousness to create a wave of new possibilities. I'm Dr. Theresa Bullard, and this is Quantum Minds TV. Welcome back to Quantum Minds TV, where we take a deep dive into various perspectives on what it's going to take to create a shift in human consciousness. Now, in this episode, we are continuing the conversation with PhD scientist, biofield researcher, psychologist, author, and teacher, Dr. Shamini Jain, who is the founder and CEO of the nonprofit Consciousness and Healing Initiative. And we are very much looking forward to continuing this conversation.
So I've got to share with you a funny story, actually, about the TED thing, which is when I have been in dialogue with them about, what's your beef? Like, what is the area of the talk that you're having the most trouble with that you feel like isn't evidence-based or whatever? One of the things that they said was, we thought you did a really good job of being very even with the data and, kind of mentioning that it's emerging data, this is very new and emerging data. But one of the things you said, we really had trouble with, and that was, I was explaining these results from MD Anderson Cancer Center. These results are showing that an energy healer, they've done several studies now, several already published and more on the way, showing that an energy healing practice, which was not done with touch, but with the person, with the mouse models of cancer. So these mice are injected with Lewis cell carcinoma, right? That's kind of studied in the same standard way you would study a drug or whatever, but in this case, they're receiving healing practice. In these studies, they've shown now that, the first time this energy healing practice compared to a mock energy healing practice was able to reduce the size of the tumor, and then the second, the spread of the tumors. And they look down to inflammatory cytokines. Those are the immune transmitters in our body. Inflammatory immune cytokines related to tumor spread and growth, reducing. Cell subsets, even cell signaling molecules, protein kinase levels and things like that. So really drilling down into the physiological pathways that are responsible for the spread of the tumor in the body and demonstrating that all of these were affected with the energy healing. And so I presented this data in the TEDx, and I said, what's amazing about this? These results are really mind-blowing, because in this study, it's not a drug or a device that's having these effects. It's simply a person channeling the currents of compassion to ignite a healing response. Because this is what all the healers tell us is happening, no matter what tradition. This is what they say. I'm allowing for a greater consciousness to come through me. And I use the term channeling currents of compassion because there is a sense of presence and love that is facilitating that return to wholeness for the person to allow the healing process to happen. Well, TED took real issue with it. And they said, it's like you're saying that's the mechanism. And at first I thought, I never said that was the mechanism. And then I sat and I said, wait, what if it is the mechanism?
I was going to say,
why is that so threatening? Could love be the mechanism?
And compassion?
Why is that so threatening? There's a
whole... The very word mechanism, if I may, the very word mechanism means it's mechanistic. They want the mechanical explanation.
It's a misnomer. It's you cannot apply it. And I even say this in the TEDx talk. It implies a singularity too, as if there's one effect and one pathway. And we know the body doesn't even work that way. That's not the way biology works. There is never any one pathway for anything.
Everything is so interconnected. And I love that you're taking much more, not only a systems approach, you're taking a holistic approach, like a whole being approach. And, so you bringing up, I think, a good segue back into some of your research. Now, some of the work you did was looking at cancer survivors who've been through all of the treatments, the chemo, the radiation, and so forth, but they were done with those treatments, so post-treatment, but they were still experiencing a lot of fatigue. And whether it was just a few months after or even a couple, like 10 years down the line, still experiencing the fatigue as a result of their, cancer treatments. And you hypothesize that potentially some of this fatigue could be that they're holding on to emotional, physical, psychological, social elements within the biofield. So, and I would say that this isn't just about cancer survivors. I mean, we could potentially extrapolate this to all manner of autoimmune diseases. You know, a lot of people are experiencing fatigue, and they can't find a reason. And when they go to the doctor says, "Oh, it's psychological. Let me give you this Prozac," and you know, they just sort of prescribe it away. And but what if those elements, those aspects are being held within the biofield? And that kind of brings us back to, is it that the body and what we're experiencing here is more the result of things that are happening at higher frequency levels, higher energy levels within the biofield? So maybe you can share a bit more about what you found with that.
They're all connected systems. You know, when I started the study, I went to my healing teacher, Reverend Rosalind Bruyere, who's considered a grandmother of healing by many. And I said, Rosalind, we have this puzzle. Cancer-related fatigue is the #1 complaint among cancer patients and survivors. Over a third of patients are going to experience debilitating fatigue, even 10 years post-treatment. And modern medicine still doesn't know how to treat it. You know, I had patients calling me saying, my doctor's trying to give me an SSRI for depression, but that doesn't help my fatigue because I'm not depressed. I'm just tired. So I asked Rosalind, I said, what do you think is going on? And she said, well, Shamini, their bone marrow chi is depleted. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, they've been through a lot, you know, not just psychologically, but physically through the cancer process. Who knows whether it's related to chemotherapy or radiation? People are still trying to sort that out. Surgery. In our study, we had patients that had gone through all different kinds, whether it was chemo, radiation, surgery, or all three, right? So we still don't know the etiology of all of the fatigue, but we know that fatigue and depression are very linked because, you know, when we can't get up and go and we can't do the things we want to do, we feel badly. We get more depressed, and then it becomes this vicious spiral. So how do we address it? Rosalind had recommended that we do a hands-on approach called energy chelation. And, you know, at that time I said, and Rosalind, what is energy chelation? What are you talking about? Is that like chelating the blood? And she said, well, kind of, because what we're doing is we're working into the bone. We're literally, because, you know, all these energy healers understand that the body being physical is an illusion. We're just atoms, you know, we're just a conglomeration of atoms. So she said, we train our practitioners to feel all the way into the bone and stimulate the bone marrow chi. So literally, from their perspective, they're stimulating those stem cells, right? Those bone marrow stem cells into the body. And we're drawing out toxicities that may have been left over from whether they're psychological, whether, you know, energetic, physical, from the treatments, whatever they are, but we're going to allow for the drawing out of toxicity. And so, of course, we know this in all the holistic traditions. There's always a sense of clearing out the old, putting in the new, clearing out the old, putting in the new. And so what we found was, of course, this profound decrease in fatigue. And as you know, Theresa, this was a randomized placebo-controlled trial that I conducted at UC San Diego because I was very interested in the placebo effect and whether all of this could be explained by placebo. We can get into that if we want. So we had this sort of placebo arm, which we called mock healing, which was touch, basically, where we trained skeptical scientists who were not energy healers, didn't practice yoga or meditation, on how to place their hands. All the sessions were done in silence. And we had a weightless control group who just kind of went along their day. And we did find that those women who received energy healing dropped down in like 4 weeks of receiving 8 treatments twice a week to levels of what you would expect for someone walking down the street. And what blew me away, though, was it wasn't just their self-reported fatigue that changed, their physiology changed. So the rhythm of their cortisol throughout the day changed. And we know that cortisol rhythm throughout the day is an important biomarker for cancer-related fatigue. One study has actually shown that aberrations or dysregulations in that cortisol rhythm for cancer patients is linked to increased risk in death. And we know it's related to fatigue and depression too. So I'm looking at this data and I'm not understanding, how is it that it's only the energy healing, women that receive the energy healing, that are showing the shift in the hormones? Why didn't the people who receive touch get that? Touch is physical. Touch stimulates immune function. Touch, makes us feel better. I mean, we saw some of that in our data. There were some effects for the placebo group. There was some reductions in fatigue. Women reported that they enjoyed that process. They felt better, just not as good as the people who received the real energy healing. But when it came to the physiology, they didn't show that response. So then the question was, well, how is energy getting under the skin and stimulating these changes all the way down to our hormones? And then, of course, I find out about my dear colleague Susan Lukendorf at the University of Iowa, who did her own study on healing touch, comparing it with relaxation in a weightless control group, finding again that women who received the biofield therapy, the healing touch, showed a preservation of their immune function during chemoradiation. She didn't see that for the relaxation group or the weightless control group. So, we began to be very curious and discuss this. And as I talk about in the book, I have a whole chapter on, okay, if this is real, you know, then we would be seeing these effects with cells, with animals, and we are. In these cases, and this is where we can have a lively conversation about what really is the placebo effect. Most people will say, well, if you're studying an animal, there's no placebo effect. I question that, actually.
Oh,
We can get
yeah.
into that. But the point is, even in these carefully controlled studies with cells and with mice and rats, cancer models mostly, that, this work has been done with, but not just in cancer, we're seeing these profound effects of energy getting under the skin, driving physiological responses in profound ways that matter for our health.
Hmm.
So, of course, the scientists and the journal article editors and others want to know, what's the mechanism? How are we explaining this? And I'll just share one piece of kind of behind the scenes, what's happening without sharing too much, but just with respect to my colleagues who are conducting this work, for example, at these major cancer centers, the amount of rigor and the amount of political maneuvering that they're having to go through just to get these studies conducted is incredible. So they have internal and external scientific review boards of skeptical scientists that are carefully poring through this data, doing their best to make sure that the research doesn't get shut down, even if people are fearful of the results. There's just so much that goes on to even be able to allow this research to happen, much less see the light of day once it's conducted. Because the aim here for all these researchers is to publish, not to just sort of have an anecdotal aside and say, I saw this, but to really make an impact in the scientific community, because this is big. This is about the power of our consciousness all the way down to the physical level to heal, and what it could mean for even our understanding of biology. Basic biology is tremendous.
Yeah, it's amazing. And you mentioned again, like how difficult it is to get the research not only funded to conduct it and then to publish it. There's so many like gateways that have to be passed to get that. And so when people say, oh, well, there's no evidence, it's like, no, there is, but you don't understand the process that has to go into valid research. It takes a lot of money, number one. It takes a devotion. Then you got to work your way through the skeptics, who are the ones that are determining who gets the funding. And then, when you get it and then you do the research and then you publish, and then you've got the gatekeepers for the publications and whether or not they accept your publication, right? So again, it's like, I so appreciate the work that you've done with your book to bring together, like, here is, like, I've scoured through everything. I've done my own research. I've met with other people who've done the research. Here's, all of the data that's been published. You can go dig into it yourself, but here's also my summary of it. And then, so showing again the biofield and the potential mechanisms, right? We're still trying to identify exactly what they might be, but to show, okay, well, energy healers say, yes, we're clearing away the negative, the blocks, the toxins, whatnot. We're replenishing vital life force energy, creating greater flow. That's a very experiential, kind of intuitive way of describing it. But your research and the research of other people you've connected with and studied, it shows biological, physiological effects that go beyond placebo, beyond just the power of belief, as a direct result of energy healing. And I'm wondering if you can, if you could list out, not only are there hormonal effects, there's, positive immune function effects. What other kinds of effects in a biological way has been measured, from various studies on energy healing.
Well, let's start with cells first, because this begs the question of why are we calling it energy and information? There are several studies that have been conducted in different labs at this point, including Harvard and the University of Connecticut, with different types of healers. In Harvard, they looked at this with external Qigong.
Mm.
In University of Connecticut, they looked at it with therapeutic touch. So just to kind of recap for folks, we've been talking about studies with different approaches. Mine was with a hands-on healing approach, which is similar to laying on of hands. Susan Lukendorf's study with cancer patients was with healing touch. These cell studies now, we're looking at external Qigong and therapeutic touch. So we're not just talking about one healing modality. Both of these studies found some really interesting and resonant kind of synergistic things, looking at different models with cancer cells and normal cells. And what they found was when healers directed energy, so now these are cells in a dish, right? They're not in an animal or person. When healers would direct their energy at the cells and they were cancerous, they would decrease a number. That is, they would show a decrease in proliferation. When they would direct their energy toward healthy cells, the cells would grow, they would proliferate. Why?
There's intelligence
How does
there.
it? There's an intelligence to the energy. We don't even know how to measure what the information is that is being carried in this energy to the outside observer. It's the same healer. Are the frequencies the same? We don't know. We don't know quite how to measure all the frequencies yet. We don't even know if we can measure all the frequencies. So we don't know if it's a shift in energy per se, but we do know that some of these studies have been done at a distance, which means that it's not energy in the way that we think about energy in the classical sense that drops off at a distance. There's information that's being carried in this energy, this what we call energy, that somehow has the intelligence to know whether or not these cells should proliferate or grow, or whether they shouldn't. Okay, so again, not just one lab, several labs that have been showing this. And I mentioned, the work being done by my dear colleague Lorenza Cohen at MD Anderson Cancer Center. My dear colleague Gloria Gronowicz at the University of Connecticut, who did some of the cell work, also did work with mice and cancer models, finding again similar things for therapeutic touch compared to a mock therapeutic touch intervention. A decrease in cancer spread through the body, decreases in certain inflammatory cytokines related to that cancer spread. And Lorenzo then took some of the work that Gloria was doing and built upon it, because and I will say this is one of my joys of having the Consciousness and Healing Initiative. We started off really to create community for these scientists so that they could connect and make sure they were synergizing with their work. And that has been very successful. I will say, it's been a real joy to bring many of these scientists together. Many of them serve on our scientific advisory council so that they can synergize and learn from each other, even though this work is very much not in the mainstream yet. As I mentioned, Lorenzo's work is profound, and I get into all those details in my book for those of you who want real deep cellular data. It's in there. I think the book has about 700 peer-reviewed published scientific references in it. So if you want to go straight to those studies, you can access all of it. It's very real. But to be brief, Lorenzo is looking at the same inflammatory cytokines similar to Gloria's, related to cancer spread, but he's also looking at cell signaling and doing deeper work, which isn't published yet, on trying to really examine how is this energy affecting cell-cell communication. And one of the early studies that we've seen that has been published, for example, is at least with one healer, again, a completely different healing approach, they found that the energy healing did affect the flux of voltage gradients across cell membranes, meaning that the ionic flux of calcium, for example, across these cell membranes were affected by the presence of the energy healer actively directing energy at these cells. So, and that's just one study. I think we're going to see more studies like this, really looking at the calcium flux. You may know very well, I'm sure you do, Theresa, the work of Mei-Wan Ho, who has created many theories around this. Jim Oshman, who has been talking about the intracellular matrix for some time. How is this happening? So we have some clues, some ideas. We haven't put together all the pieces scientifically. We have some ideas, and I wouldn't even call it mechanism as much as a process What are the cellular processes taking place where energy is getting under the skin? Now, one of the things Lorenzo is doing now, because the journal editors, he wants to publish this in a mainstream high integrity journal like Science or Nature. That's what he's going for. These results are profound. And these editors want to know the mechanism. So they want him to do these blocking studies like you would do with a drug, knock out the genes that are responsible for this pathway and see if you still see this. And I said, so I interviewed Lorenzo recently for our Science of Healing course, which I want to make sure I share about because it's an incredible course where we're interviewing a lot of these scientists on their work. And Lorenzo is one of them. So related to mechanism, we're seeing all of these effects, as you said, in these physiological ways. But is it really just one pathway? And I said to Lorenzo, what happens if you knock out these mice and, you think you've got this pathway and the protein kinase levels of this particular pathway are going, you block it, the genetics. Do you think that you won't see an effect in some other pathway? Because the body is pleiotropic, right? Even cytokines themselves will respond differently depending on their cell environment.
Mm.
So if you knock out the genes for a particular pathway, don't you think that the body's intelligence might say, okay, well, I can't transmit the energy through this pathway. I'm going to transmit it through another pathway, because we know the body does that, right? It's a thing. Even placebo effects don't just happen from one pathway. So, that gave him pause. And he said, well, it's possible. And I said, well, I hope you're going to measure that, because I think the body has so much more intelligence than we've even scratched the surface of our understanding of.
Mm. You're really touching on a fundamental shift in the mindset by which scientists approach their research from the old paradigm way, which was materialistic, reductionistic, trying to isolate and separate different parts. And once you isolate and separate and you understand how individual parts work, they think they automatically know how the whole works. And they're completely ignoring the synergy of interactions. And then everything's deterministic, right? These are sort of the four principles of the Newtonian mindset. Whereas now we're coming into this whole new mindset that is saying, no, it's like almost the opposite. Everything is connected. It's integrated. It's synergistic. It's about the relationships between things. There's a complementarity that comes in, not just in physics like quantum physics, but in many, many things. There's this complementarity principle that comes in. Consciousness affects things. There's uncertainties and many possibilities simultaneously of how things can happen. There's a whole mindset that needs to come in to the scientific way of thinking about and approaching things. And I love that you're bringing that conversation forward, that, we need to take more that holistic approach, that integrated systems-based approach, and not just think that we can isolate. The reason that scientists and medicine usually wants to isolate is so that they can then figure out how to reverse engineer to create the drug.
Exactly. And that's not what we're doing here. So that approach, I think, is very misguided when we're studying healing. And I will just flat out say it. I think the approach is misguided. I understand why some of our scientists are going in that direction, because they can't publish their research unless they play that game. But if we're truly interested in understanding the wisdom of the body, it's so limited. And Theresa, I just love what you said about complementarity. I have been sitting with this for a while now. And one of the ways that I have been describing the lopsided nature of our understanding of healing is, we have been sort of moving in, for lack of better terms, I've been using the terms masculine and feminine. And we can think of those as just, aspects of complementarity. Really, that's what they are. Yeah. And I use those terms because so many indigenous healing traditions have described them in that way. And, I want to remind everybody, of course, we're not talking about male and female. We're talking about aspects of consciousness that are within all of us and the nature of those aspects as described by those traditions. So what is the masculine approach to medicine, in my view, in the modern Western world these days? It's finding the mechanism. It's targeting that. It's getting really drilled down into the details of a system, which is beautiful. We've made so much progress that way. And when we aren't balanced with the other side of that, we think everything is about that singular magic bullet. And I don't think we have to belabor the conversation. Everyone knows where that train is headed and what the problems are with it, right? But when we look at the data with energy healing, and even the broader psychological literature, including placebo, and even things like social support. There's a whole other side of healing that, because we've been so narrowly focused on this idea of these singular molecular mechanisms, we're not acknowledging the totality of how healing is happening. And in my view, that does have to do with what we have described as those feminine aspects. What does that mean? It's about presence. I mean, I don't even think we scratch the surface of understanding how presence, how do we even study presence? What is presence? How is presence allowing for the healing process to take place? There is an allowing that is taking place. There is an energetic exchange that is happening that, to some degree, at this point in time, is immeasurable and yet incredibly powerful, right? So, from a complementarity perspective, how do we take a filter like that and approach it to the science of healing? I think it's a really critical question for us at this juncture.
Well, that's one of the things that ultimately caused me to shift my own trajectory, because I saw, within science, at least in the physics sense, I saw how much, we were advancing into the minutia and the detail level. And, we were really making a lot of progress from that logical approach. And yet we've reached a point where, and we see this in our world today, we've reached a point where our knowledge and the tools that are at our disposal because of that knowledge and the technologies we've created have exceeded our wisdom. And we need to bring the wisdom back in, the wisdom of the heart, the wisdom of the spirit, the ancient wisdom, to come back in to guide the application of the knowledge and the tools and the technology in a way that is truly in the good of the whole. And I
Yeah.
find that feminine side really comes in with the nurturing, like we need to care for the family, we need to care for the whole, not just the bottom line. And so these can be two complementary, and it's not one or the other, because if you go too far to the feminine side, it's not going to be balanced either. But it's the dance between the two, and it's recognizing that there is a dance and that we need to have that dance between a masculine approach, a feminine approach, a logical approach, and a compassionate approach. The mind and the heart, and weaving them, and complementarity says you can't actually measure both of these complementary pairs at the same time. So, it is just like when you're walking, you're shifting your weight from left to right. And there is a dance that happens through that. The yin and the yang are constantly, rotating within each other. And yet a little bit of the yin is inside the yang, a little bit of the yang is inside the yin. And they transform into one another while they also spin. But the key is to maintain that balance. And so I saw that we've gone so far with that logical, rational approach, and it serves its purpose, but we need that intuitive wisdom and the spirit to come back in order to help guide it towards the application that is in the good of the whole versus the good of just the few. So that was, on a different topic, but I just wanted to
No,
comment.
I think very resonant, absolutely very resonant. And you hit on, what are the key motivations that are preventing us from having full information, right? And I love what you said about the dance that we have to dance, because, you can't measure both things at the same time. So as practitioners, as scientists, how do we move with that dance? And why is it important for us to stand in the wisdom of silence to get the information needed to know what tools to create,
Mm,
what tools to release? Our tools are only as good as the consciousness that's created it.
I think that silence, I think Khalil Gibran talked about, our joys and our sorrows rising and falling, and only when we are still are we at that balance point, or at that stillness point. The silence allows us to come to that stillness of the dance, so we can actually get some perspective on where we at, right? And then maybe where do we need to redirect, and in order to keep the dance flowing versus everything kind of toppling too far to one side. So I love that you brought that silence and stillness aspect in there, because it's a big key to tapping into wisdom. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Quantum Minds TV. And as always, thank you so much for tuning in. Now, if you enjoyed it, please do rate, review, and subscribe to us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and or Spotify. And if you really would like to be the first to receive full access and instant access as soon as each conscious conversation becomes available with each new guest, you can register at quantummindstv.com with your name and email. It's completely free to register, and it'll provide you with a secret link where you can then log in to access the entire conversations as soon as they're available and watch them at your leisure. So it's been a pleasure. And until next time, I'm Dr. Theresa Bullard White, and this is Quantum Minds TV.
This conscious conversation was created, produced, and recorded by Dr. Theresa Bullard White in collaboration with Dr. Shamini Jain and edited by Verse Content and Depth Perception Films. The theme music and intro videography were created by Tim Mountain of Even Load Productions. Quantum Minds TV is a product of the Quantum Learning Academy.